Welcome to Bedtime Biographies. Wherever you are tonight, tucked in bed, resting on the sofa, or somewhere quiet with the lights turned low, we are glad you are here. Tonight's story is a long one, and it is meant to carry you slowly, gently, through an entire life. There is no rush. There is nowhere else to be. Before we settle fully into the story, you are warmly welcome to leave a comment below. Tell us where in the world you are listening from tonight, or let us know which historical figure you would like us to spend an evening with next. And if these quiet biographies help you rest, subscribing is a simple way to help more people find them. Now let the evening begin. There is a particular kind of tragedy that history tends to overlook. Not the dramatic kind, not battles lost or kingdoms burned, but the quieter kind. The kind that settles over a life slowly, like weather. The kind where a person spends decades trying to be good, trying to be steady, trying to hold something together. And the world remembers them anyway, for the moments when everything came apart. George III of Great Britain was that kind of figure. He is remembered, most often, for two things: the American Revolution, the colonies he lost, and the madness, the illness that clouded the last years of his long reign. Both of those things are true, in their way. But neither of them comes close to explaining who he actually was. And that gap between what history remembers and what a life actually contained is worth sitting with tonight. The real George, the one behind the portrait and the caricature, was a man of genuine warmth, deep seriousness, and profound private suffering. He was a devoted husband in an era when devotion was not especially fashionable among kings. He was a lover of farming, of music, of books, of clocks and mechanical things. He was a man who wanted, more than almost anything else, to be a good king. And the painful irony of his life is that his very earnestness, his desire to do things properly, to hold firm, to stand for something, contributed directly to some of the greatest catastrophes of his reign. What does it do to a person to try that hard and still have history judge them so harshly? That is the question that runs quietly through everything we will hear tonight. I find myself returning to George III more than most figures from this period, not because his story is triumphant, but because it is honest. There is something in his particular combination of duty and blindness, of tenderness and stubbornness, that feels very human. He was not a villain. He was not a hero. He was a man doing his best inside a role that was far too large and far too strange for any single person to carry gracefully. George William Frederick was born on the 4th of June, 1738, at Norfolk House in St. James's Square, London. He came into the world 2 months early, and those first hours were uncertain enough that he was baptized almost immediately in case he did not survive the night. He did survive, but that fragile beginning, the hurried candlelit ceremony, the hushed worry in the room, set a particular tone. George's life would be marked again and again by precariousness, arriving without warning. His father was Frederick, Prince of Wales, the eldest son of King George II. His mother was Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, a young German princess who had come to England for precisely this purpose: to marry into the British royal family and continue the line. Frederick and Augusta were not especially close to the king. In fact, George II and his son Frederick had one of the more openly hostile relationships in the history of the British monarchy. They disliked each other with a consistency that was almost impressive. The royal court at the time was divided, in a very real sense, between those who gathered around the king and those who gathered around the Prince of Wales. It was a court split down the middle, and young George was born directly into that divide. Norfolk House itself was a tall, fashionable townhouse on a quiet London square, the kind of place where carriages clattered past on the cobblestones below, and fires burned in every room through the cold months. George spent his earliest years there, and at Kew, where the family had a house near the river. Kew in those days was not the grand botanical garden it would later become, but it was green and spacious and unhurried, and the young prince seems to have loved it. He would return to Kew again and again throughout his life. It became, in many ways, the place that felt most like home. His childhood was shaped by two things above all others. The first was the death of his father. Frederick, Prince of Wales, died in March of 1751, when George was only 12 years old. The cause was a sudden illness, a pleurisy by most accounts, that took him quickly and without much warning. George had not been especially close to his father in the way that a modern child might expect, but the loss was still profound. In a single afternoon, the 12-year-old boy became the heir apparent to the British throne. Everything changed. The weight of what he was expected to become settled onto him immediately, and it never really lifted. The second shaping force was his mother, Augusta. After Frederick's death, she became the dominant influence in her son's life. She was a careful, serious woman, protective to the point of isolation. She worried constantly about the corrupting influence of the royal court, about flattery, about loose morals, about the kind of people who would seek to manipulate a future king for their own purposes. And so she kept George close. She limited his contact with the wider world. His education was conducted largely at home, by tutors chosen with great deliberateness, and his circle of companions was narrow and closely watched. This caution was not without reason. The court of George II was not a gentle place, and Augusta understood better than most how quickly a young royal could be shaped by the wrong influences. But the consequence of her protectiveness was that George grew up unusually sheltered. He was studious and earnest and well-intentioned, but he had very little experience of the ordinary world, and very little practice navigating the complex, shifting landscape of real political life. He knew what he was supposed to be. He had a much less clear sense of how to become it. His tutors described him as a slow but diligent student. He struggled in his early years with reading and with retaining information, and there is some suggestion that he found formal learning genuinely difficult as a young child. But he was persistent. He worked steadily, carefully, and over time he became genuinely learned. He developed a deep interest in agriculture, in science, in architecture, and above all in music. He played the harpsichord and the flute with real ability, and throughout his life, music remained one of his most consistent sources of private pleasure. Later, as king, he would assemble one of the finest musical collections in Europe. Handel was a particular favorite, and he attended performances with a concentration and delight that people around him often remarked upon. There was something about George, even as a boy, that inspired a kind of affection in those who knew him closely. He was not glamorous or witty, in the way that court culture rewarded. He was not clever in the sharp, surface-level sense, but he was genuinely kind, and he was sincere. And in a world built largely on performance and maneuver, that sincerity stood out. It also made him vulnerable in ways he would not fully understand until much later. By the time he was in his late teens, he was a tall, healthy young man with a round, open face and blue eyes. He dressed carefully and carried himself with the particular kind of formal dignity that had been trained into him from childhood. But those who spent time with him in private spoke of someone warmer and less rigid than the public image suggested. He laughed easily. He was curious about ordinary things, about how farms worked, about the mechanics of clocks, about the habits of birds. He had none of the contempt for common life that marked many of his aristocratic contemporaries. He was, in some essential way, a modest person wearing the clothes of a future king. In the late 1750s, as George moved through his teenage years and into early adulthood, the world around him was changing at a pace that must have felt both exciting and unsettling. Britain was at war. The 7 Years' War, which had spread across Europe and beyond, into North America, into India, into the Caribbean, was reshaping the balance of power in ways that no one had fully anticipated. Armies moved across continents. Ships exchanged fire on distant seas. And back in London, in the drawing rooms and corridors of power, men argued constantly about strategy, about money, about what kind of country Britain was becoming. George watched all of this from a particular distance. He was not yet a king, and he was not yet fully a man in the political sense. He was still the heir, still under his mother's careful supervision, still being formed. But he was paying attention. He read the newspapers. He corresponded with his tutors. He thought deeply about what kind of king he wanted to be. And the conclusions he reached were serious ones. He had grown up hearing, from his mother and from the men she trusted, that the great danger facing the monarchy was the unchecked power of the political factions, the great Whig families who had dominated British government since the early part of the century, who had grown rich and influential, and who treated the crown, in some respects, as a useful instrument rather than a genuine authority. George absorbed this view completely. He came to believe, with real conviction, that a good king should be active, engaged, independent, not a figurehead, not a puppet of ministers, a king who actually governed. This belief would shape everything that followed. It was not a cynical belief, and it was not a selfish one. George genuinely thought that a strong, virtuous monarch was what Britain needed. He had read his history. He had studied the reigns of previous kings with the attentiveness of someone who knew he would one day need to apply those lessons. He wanted to be, in the deepest sense, worthy of the role. But there was something in this conviction, something slightly rigid, slightly impervious to complication, that would cause him enormous difficulty later on. The world of 18th century politics was not a world that rewarded rigid conviction. It was a world of compromise and negotiation, of shifting alliances and pragmatic adjustments. And George, for all his intelligence and seriousness, was not naturally a man of compromise. That small tendency, the leaning toward firmness over flexibility, was already present in him as a young man. At the time, it seemed like strength. It would take years for the cost of it to become clear. During these years, George also experienced something unexpected. He fell in love. The object of his affection was Lady Sarah Lennox, a young woman of striking beauty and easy charm who moved in the circles adjacent to the royal household. George was genuinely smitten. He wrote about her with a warmth that was quite unlike his usual careful, measured correspondent. He thought about marrying her. For a brief period, it seems he thought about very little else. But marriage for a future king was not a personal matter. It was a political one. The advisors around George, and his mother in particular, made clear that an English aristocrat, however lovely, was not a suitable match for the heir to the throne. The conventions of the time demanded a Protestant princess from one of the German royal houses, someone whose lineage was unimpeachable, someone whose marriage would serve the interests of the crown. George accepted this. He did not fight it, or at least not openly. But it is worth pausing for a moment on what that acceptance cost him. He was a young man, 21 or 22 years old, with a genuine emotional life, and he was asked to set that emotional life aside in the interest of duty. And he did. That capacity for self-suppression, for placing obligation above desire, would remain with him for the rest of his life. It was one of his genuine virtues. It was also, at times, one of the things that made him difficult to reach. The princess selected for him was Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. She was 17 years old when they met, in September of 1761, just hours before their wedding ceremony. They had never seen each other before that day. By the conventions of royal marriage, this was entirely normal. But it is still a striking thing to consider. Two young people meeting for the first time in a room full of courtiers and ceremony, knowing that by the end of the evening, they would be husband and wife. Charlotte was not conventionally beautiful, and she knew it. She was small and somewhat plain-featured, with a composure that had been carefully cultivated through years of preparation for exactly this kind of moment. She was intelligent, musically gifted, and possessed of a calm that would prove deeply important in the years to come. George, by all accounts, was kind to her from the very first meeting. He went out of his way to put her at ease. And Charlotte, who might reasonably have been terrified, seems to have found in him something steady and reassuring. What happened between them? Slowly, over the months and years that followed, was something that neither of them had necessarily expected. They fell in love, not with the sudden intensity of a romance, but with the gradual, deepening warmth of two people who had decided to build something together and had discovered, to their own surprise, that they genuinely wanted to. George was faithful to Charlotte throughout their long marriage. This at a time when royal infidelity was so commonplace as to be almost expected. He did not keep mistresses. He did not conduct affairs. He went home to his wife, night after night, across decades of a life that brought him enormous pressure and frequent unhappiness. And he seems to have found in her the one place where he could simply be himself. They had 15 children together. 15. The nurseries at Kew and Windsor were rarely quiet. And while the relationships between George and his sons would eventually become strained, painfully so in the case of several of them, his relationship with Charlotte remained, by almost every account, one of the steadier and more genuine partnerships in the history of the British royal family. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. In October of 1760, before the wedding, before Charlotte, the old king died. George II passed away at Kensington Palace, quickly and without prolonged suffering, at the age of 77. And George, 22 years old, became King of Great Britain. He'd been preparing for this moment for nearly a decade. He had thought about it, read about it, been trained for it. And yet there is something about the actual arrival of power that no amount of preparation can fully account for. The weight of it, the finality. One morning, you are the heir, the future thing, the person waiting in the wings. And the next morning, the stage is yours, and it never stops being yours. And there is nowhere to go when the performance becomes exhausting. George's early years as king were marked by a genuine and somewhat restless energy. He wanted to be involved. He wanted to understand the details of government, to engage with the ministers who were managing the affairs of the nation, to exercise the kind of active royal authority he'd always believed was proper and necessary. He worked long hours. He read extensively. He wrote letters in a large, clear, rounded hand that later archivists would find pleasingly legible. Page after page after page of royal correspondence, covering everything from matters of high policy to the management of the royal farms. Those farms were already becoming a source of real pleasure to him. George had a genuine passion for agriculture that went well beyond the fashionable rural nostalgia of his era. He was seriously interested in the science of farming, in soil conditions, in crop rotation, in the breeding of livestock, in the new agricultural methods that were beginning to transform the English countryside. He would visit his farms at Windsor and at Kew with the focused attention of a man who genuinely cared about the results. The nickname that his subjects eventually gave him, Farmer George, was meant partly as an affectionate joke, but it captured something true. He was, in some deep and private sense, more comfortable in a field than in a throne room. The early years of his reign were politically turbulent in ways that were not entirely of his making. He was trying to exert royal authority in a system that had been moving for decades toward a different arrangement, one where the great ministers and parliamentary factions held the real power. His attempts to appoint ministers of his own choosing to break the dominance of the old Whig families created friction and controversy. He was accused by his critics of trying to reverse the constitutional gains of the previous century, of trying to be, in effect, too much of a king. Those accusations were not entirely fair. George was not trying to establish a tyranny. He was trying to govern in the way that he genuinely believed a king should govern. But the accusations stuck, and they spread, and they colored the way that many people in Britain, and eventually across the Atlantic, understood what he was doing and what he represented. Because across the Atlantic, in the 13 American colonies, something had been building for years. A tension, a growing sense among the colonists that the relationship between Britain and America was not what it ought to be, that they were being taxed without being represented, that decisions affecting their lives were being made in a parliament 3,000 miles away, in which they had no voice, that they were being treated, in some essential way, as subjects rather than citizens. George understood this tension imperfectly, and that imperfect understanding would prove to be one of the great failures of his reign. He was not, in principle, hostile to the colonies. He did not think of the Americans as enemies. But he believed, with that characteristic firmness, that the authority of the British Crown over its territories was not a matter for negotiation. It was a constitutional fact, and any challenge to that authority, however understandable the grievances behind it, was something that had to be resisted. The Stamp Act of 1765, which imposed a direct tax on the colonies, had been deeply unpopular from the moment of its introduction. The colonial protests were passionate and widespread. The act was eventually repealed, but the underlying question, the question of who had the right to tax whom, had not gone away. It had simply gone quieter for a time. And quiet, as George was learning, did not mean resolved. Through the late 1760s and into the 1770s, the situation shifted gradually, then more quickly. New taxes, new protests. The Boston Massacre, in which British soldiers fired on a crowd of civilians, leaving 5 people dead, and a story that spread through the colonies with the speed of something that had been waiting to be told. The Boston Tea Party, in which colonists threw an entire shipment of British tea into the harbour in protest at taxation, and in which George saw not a political demonstration, but an act of defiance that could not go unanswered. He was not wrong exactly. That authority, once undermined, tends to keep being tested. But he was wrong about what kind of response the situation called for. Where flexibility and negotiation might still have found a path, George and the ministers around him chose firmness. The coercive acts, what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, were passed in 1774, designed to punish Massachusetts and reassert British authority. They had the opposite effect. They united the colonies in a way that nothing else had managed to do, and they made what had been a serious grievance feel, to many Americans, like an act of war. By the time the first shots were exchanged at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, the situation had moved beyond the point where any single decision could have turned it around. The war that followed, the American Revolutionary War, lasted 8 years. It was costly and painful, and in the end, unsuccessful. In 1783, Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States of America, and the 13 colonies were gone. George took this badly. Of course he did. He had held firm because he believed it was right to hold firm. He had pressed for resolution because he genuinely believed that British authority over the colonies was not only legally correct, but ultimately in everyone's interest. And he had been wrong. Not wrong in his intentions, perhaps, but wrong in his reading of the situation, wrong in his choice of methods, and wrong in his inability to see, until it was far too late, that the world had already changed in ways that made the old certainties obsolete. There is a letter that George wrote in the aftermath of American independence, in which he expressed the depth of his distress and his continued conviction that he had tried to do what was right. It is a melancholy document. Not because it is self-pitying. George was not, characteristically, a self-pitying man, but because it reveals someone who genuinely could not understand where things had gone so badly wrong. He had worked so hard. He had held to his principles, and the outcome had still been catastrophe. That gap between effort and outcome, between intention and consequence, is one of the defining sorrows of his life, and it would deepen in the years to come in ways that had nothing to do with politics at all. Through the early 1780s, George continued to govern with the same diligence he had always brought to the role. The loss of America had wounded him, But it had not broken him. He was in his mid-40s now, still physically healthy, still working long hours, still filling page after page with that careful, rounded handwriting. The farms at Windsor were flourishing. Charlotte was beside him. The children were growing. On the surface, at least, life had a shape to it that was recognizable and ordered. But something was changing underneath, something quiet and difficult to name that would only become visible later when people looked back and tried to understand what had happened. The first serious episode came in 1788. George was 50 years old. It began, as these things often do, with something small, an unsettled stomach, a restlessness, a difficulty sleeping. His words began to come faster than usual. He talked at great length, with an intensity that those around him found alarming. He moved erratically between moods. He seemed to the people who knew him best like a man whose inner weather had turned suddenly and without warning. Within weeks, the situation had become serious. George was agitated and confused. He said things that made no sense. He talked for hours without stopping. He wrote letters that rambled and looped back on themselves. At one point, he reportedly talked for so long that he lost his voice entirely and still seemed compelled to keep speaking. The doctors were called, and then more doctors. And the treatments they offered, the restraints, the purges, the blistering, were the treatments of an era that did not yet understand what it was looking at. What George was experiencing, historians and physicians have argued about ever since. For a long time, the most widely accepted explanation was porphyria, a rare metabolic disorder that can, in certain forms, produce neurological and psychiatric symptoms. More recently, some researchers have suggested that the arsenic present in the medicines he was given may have worsened his condition significantly, or even triggered some of his episodes. Others have pointed to bipolar disorder. The honest answer is that no one knows for certain, and the honest answer is also that the uncertainty itself is part of the story. Here was a man whose suffering was real, and whose doctors, through no fault other than the limitations of their time, were largely unable to help him. The episode of 1788 lasted several months. It was a period of enormous political instability because a king who could not perform his duties left a constitutional void that the competing factions in Parliament were quick to try to fill. The Prince of Wales, the future George IV, was positioned to become regent, and he was aligned with the Whig opposition, which meant that a regency would likely bring down the current government. It was, in the language of politics, a crisis. People in the corridors of Westminster were manoeuvring and calculating, placing bets on how long the king would remain incapacitated. And then, in the early months of 1789, George recovered. The symptoms eased. The agitation faded. He became himself again, or something close enough to himself that those around him could breathe. He returned to his duties, to his farms, to his correspondence. He went to Weymouth, on the Dorset coast, to recuperate by the sea, and the people there greeted him with a warmth that moved him genuinely. Ordinary people, lining the shore, cheering for a king they had been afraid of losing. He bathed in the sea, accompanied by a small band that played the national anthem from a bathing machine nearby. And by all accounts, he found the whole thing rather wonderful. That image, the king in the sea, the band playing, the crowd calling out, stays with me. It is such a human moment. Not a king, just a man, glad to be well again, glad to be among people who seemed glad to have him back. The recovery brought something with it that is easy to overlook. It brought a surge of genuine public affection. The instability of the Regency crisis had reminded ordinary British people of what they stood to lose, and many of them found, somewhat to their own surprise, that they had grown genuinely fond of this king. He was not glamorous. He was not witty or fashionable or surrounded by the glittering social life that people associated with royalty. He was, in the words that people used at the time, a plain man, a decent man, a man who went to church and loved his wife and cared about his farms and tried, in his limited and sometimes mistaken way, to do what was right. That plainness, which had once seemed like a lack, had become over 30 years something that people trusted. In an era of enormous political turbulence, the American Revolution, and now the French Revolution beginning just across the Channel, there was something steadying about a king who simply kept going, who showed up, who did not run away or collapse or transform himself into something unrecognizable. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, in the same year as George's recovery, cast a long shadow over everything that followed. The fall of the Bastille in July, the gradual unraveling of the French monarchy, the execution of Louis XVI in 1793. These events sent tremors through every royal court in Europe. They were a reminder of what could happen when the relationship between a crown and its people broke down entirely. George watched all of this with a mixture of horror and a kind of grim vindication. He had always believed in order, in tradition, in the slow and careful maintenance of established institutions. The chaos across the Channel seemed to confirm what he had always feared about the consequences of disorder. Britain went to war with revolutionary France in 1793, and the long conflict that followed, eventually becoming the Napoleonic Wars, would define the final decades of George's active reign. It was, in many ways, a more straightforward test than America had been. The enemy was clearer. The stakes were more obviously existential, and George, whatever his limitations as a political strategist, had never lacked for steadiness in the face of a clear threat. He supported the war. He trusted his ministers to conduct it. And as the years wore on, and Britain held firm, while the rest of Europe bent and buckled under Napoleon's campaigns, George became something he had never quite managed to be in his earlier years. A symbol. Not a symbol in the cynical, constructed sense, but a genuine one. He had been king for so long now, through so much, that his continued presence had become a kind of anchor. He was familiar. He was constant. And constancy, in a world where almost nothing else seemed constant, had its own quiet power. His relationship with his children was, by this point, a source of real sadness. He had 15 of them, and he loved them. That much was never in doubt. But love, in George's case, did not always translate into ease. He was a strict father, particularly with his sons, and his strictness was the kind that came not from coldness, but from an excess of expectation. He wanted them to be good. He wanted them to be serious and responsible and worthy of what they had been given. And his sons, one by one, seemed to go out of their way to be the opposite. The Prince of Wales, later George IV, was the most painful case. He was extravagant where his father was frugal, dissolute where his father was faithful, fashionable where his father was plain. He ran up enormous debts He associated with people his father disapproved of. He conducted a secret and illegal marriage with a Catholic woman, Mrs. Fitzherbert, which caused a constitutional crisis of its own. And he treated his father with a casual disrespect that George felt deeply, not as an insult to the king, but as a wound from a son. The other sons brought their own varieties of difficulty. Several had children outside of marriage. Several ran up debts. The Duke of Cumberland was rumoured to be involved in a scandal of considerable darkness. George bore all of this with a stoicism that was increasingly difficult to maintain. He had built his life around the idea that duty and virtue were sufficient, that if you held to what was right, the people around you would follow. And his own children, raised in his household, educated according to his values, had become, in many cases, evidence against that belief. Charlotte remained. Through all of it, the political disasters, the illness, the disappointments with the children, Charlotte was there. She had become, over the decades, something more than a companion. She was the person in whose presence George did not have to perform or explain himself. She understood his silences. She managed the household with a quiet competence that freed him to focus on the work he felt he had been put on earth to do. She was not a woman who sought the spotlight, and she did not have the kind of forceful personality that tends to attract historical attention. But the marriage she and George had built together was, by any measure, one of the more extraordinary quiet achievements of his life. There were losses along the way that cut deep. The death of his young daughter Amelia in 1810, at the age of 27, seems to have been the blow that finally broke something in him that had, until then, remained intact. Amelia had always been his favourite, the youngest of his daughters. Gentle and affectionate, and ill for much of her short life, George had visited her, sat with her, held her hand through the long months of her decline. When she died, in November of that year, those who were with the king said that something went out of him that never came back. Within weeks, the symptoms that had first appeared in 1788 returned, but this time they did not ease. This time they settled in and deepened and became, gradually, permanent. George withdrew into a world that those around him could not enter or fully understand. He spoke to people who were not there. He played the harpsichord for hours, alone in a room, the music wandering and circling without resolution. His eyesight, which had been deteriorating for years, failed almost entirely. He became, in the end, blind and deaf, and lost inside whatever world his damaged mind had constructed for him. He did not know that Napoleon had finally been defeated. He did not know about Waterloo, about the peace, about the enormous changes that swept through Europe in those final years. He did not know that his son had formally become regent in 1811, taking over the duties of the crown that George could no longer perform. He did not know most of what was happening in the world outside the walls of Windsor Castle, where he was kept comfortable and cared for, moving quietly through rooms that he could no longer see. What he did know, or what he seemed to know, in his better moments, is harder to say. There are accounts of him playing the harpsichord and seeming in those moments to find something, a thread back to himself. Music had always been one of the truest things in his life. And even when language and memory and reason had become unreliable, the music remained. There is something in that worth holding on to. something that suggests the person he had always been. The boy who loved Handel, the young king who attended concerts with such evident delight, was still somewhere inside, even if he could no longer find his way out. He lived on for many years in that condition, longer than anyone expected, perhaps longer than was merciful. Windsor Castle in those final years was a quiet and somewhat melancholy place, at least in the rooms where George moved and slept and played his wandering music. The rest of the castle and the rest of the kingdom continued in its business. Wars ended. Treaties were signed. The world kept turning with the particular indifference that the world always shows to those who are no longer able to participate in it. George III died on the 29th of January, 1820. He was 81 years old. He had been king for nearly 60 years, which made his reign one of the longest in British history up to that point. He died, by most accounts, peacefully, in his room at Windsor, in the early evening. The candles would have been lit by then. Outside, January darkness had settled over the castle grounds, over the bare trees and the cold grass and the long stone walls that George had known since he was young. The country he left behind was almost unrecognizably different from the one he had inherited as a 22-year-old in 1760. When he became king, Britain was a significant European power engaged in a global war. When he died, it was the dominant force in the world, its navy unchallenged on the seas, its empire spreading across continents, its industries beginning the transformation that would remake the entire planet over the following century. Almost none of this was George's doing, exactly, but all of it had happened during his reign, under his watch, through the long and turbulent 60 years in which he had been the fixed point at the center of an enormously restless country. His son, the Prince Regent, became George IV on his father's death. The new king was everything his father had not been: fashionable, extravagant, obsessed with architecture and style, and the pleasures of a court that his father had always found slightly frivolous. The contrast between them was so sharp that it served in a strange way to define both men more clearly. Next to his son's excess, the old king's simplicity looked even more like virtue. Next to his father's steadiness, the new king's instability looked even more like weakness. Charlotte had died 2 years before George, in November of 1818. She had been his companion for 57 years, and her death came quietly, without the long decline that had taken him. She had not been well for some time, but the end came more quickly than expected. And George, lost in his private world by then, may not have fully understood that she was gone. There is something both sad and perhaps merciful in that. She had carried so much, for so long, and she died, at least, with the knowledge that she had done what she set out to do when she was a 17-year-old girl, standing in an unfamiliar country, about to marry a stranger. What remains of George III, when you strip away the caricatures and the simplified historical verdicts, is something more complicated and more interesting than the standard account suggests. He was not the tyrant that American revolutionary rhetoric made him. The Declaration of Independence lists his personal failings as a long series of grievances, and those grievances were real, but many of them were the acts of a government and a parliament, not of a king who sat alone plotting colonial oppression. George had his failures, his rigidity, his inability to adapt, his tendency to confuse stubbornness with principle. But the monstrous figure of American popular history is, in important ways, a simplified version of a much more human story. Nor is he quite the pitiable madman that a certain strand of historical storytelling prefers. The illness was real, and the suffering was real, and the final years were genuinely terrible. But to reduce him to his illness is to miss everything that came before it. The 60 years of genuine engagement with one of the most demanding and complicated roles that any human being can be asked to perform. He was a king for almost all of his adult life. He took that seriously, every day, for decades. That deserves more than a footnote. What strikes me most, thinking about his life as a whole, is the quality of his ordinariness. Not ordinariness in the dismissive sense, but in the deeper sense, the sense of a person who wanted, underneath the robes and the ceremony and the enormous pressure of a crown, the things that most people want: a good marriage, a comfortable home, work that felt meaningful, the chance to walk in a garden in the morning and hear music in the evening, and feel, at the end of the day, that something had been done that was worth doing. He found those things imperfectly and incompletely in the spaces between the demands of his role. The farms at Windsor, the evenings with Charlotte, the hours at the harpsichord, the careful letters written in that rounded, legible hand to people he trusted, and sometimes to people he disagreed with, but respected. The long walks through Kew when the weather was fine, and the river was visible through the trees and the world, for a moment, felt manageable. He was a man who loved clocks. This is a small detail, but it is one that I keep returning to. He had a serious and lifelong fascination with horology, with the mechanisms by which time is measured and made visible. He collected clocks and watches with genuine passion, and he understood how they worked in the way that a person who has taken something apart and put it back together understands it. There is something fitting about that. A man who spent his life trying to maintain order, trying to keep things running as they should, finding his deepest private pleasure in objects whose entire purpose is to mark the steady, reliable passage of time. Clocks do not improvise. They do not adapt. They do not negotiate. They keep doing what they were made to do, tick by tick, until they stop. George kept going, in much the same way, long after most people would have found some reason to stop, long after the losses and the failures and the illness and the grief had accumulated into something that might have crushed a less stubborn temperament. He kept going because he believed that was what was required of him, because duty, to George, was not a performance. It was the shape of a life. His legacy is genuinely difficult to assess, and perhaps that difficulty is itself telling. He presided over the loss of America, which was a catastrophe by any measure. He also presided over the defeat of Napoleon, which was one of the defining achievements of the era. He expanded the British Empire in some directions, while losing it in others. He was a constitutional monarch who genuinely believed in constitutional monarchy, even as his actions sometimes made people doubt that. He was a patron of the arts and sciences who helped establish institutions that still exist. The Royal Academy of Arts was founded in 1768 during his reign. Kew Gardens, the place he had loved since childhood, was developed into one of the great botanical collections in the world under his patronage. He was, in the end, neither the villain nor the victim that history has most often preferred him to be. He was a person of genuine substance and genuine limitation, doing an impossible job in a world that was changing faster than anyone could fully understand. He got some things badly wrong. He got other things quietly, undramatically right. And he kept showing up every day for nearly 60 years, which is its own kind of achievement, even if history does not always know how to give credit for it. The story of George III is, among other things, a story about the gap between intention and outcome, about what happens when a person of genuine good will operate with a set of assumptions that the world has already begun to leave behind, about the cost of firmness and the cost of inflexibility, and the way that virtues carried too far can become their own kind of failing. It is not a comfortable story, but it is an honest one. And there is something in his private life, in the love he had for Charlotte, in the pleasure he took in his farms and his music and his clocks, in the long ordinary evenings at Windsor that existed between and beneath the public drama of his reign, that makes him feel, across the distance of 2 centuries, surprisingly close. Not a figure in a painting, not a name on a list of monarchs, but a person who was trying, as most of us are trying, to hold things together and to find, in whatever time was available, something that felt like peace. The candles burn down, the clocks tick on, the music, for a little while longer, continues. If there is another life you would like to hear told in this quiet way, you are welcome to leave the name below. For now, let the story rest.